Hello, and welcome to another episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I'm your creepy host, Jaime Bennett. As always, listener discretion is strongly advised. Also, I am infamous for mispronouncing things. So, there's that warning label, just so you know. And I'm going to give credit where credit is due because I get my research from the good old internet. I thought that I would talk about vampires. A lot of us are fascinated by vampires, obviously. Fascinated by vampires. And I wanted to talk about the real history of vampires in New Orleans. I've talked about this before. I know numerous people have talked about it. Vampires are popular. We're fascinated with them. You know how it goes. But I love New Orleans. I've actually been to New Orleans. I have done some mission work in New Orleans. I've talked about that before on my show. And any show that includes witches, vampires, werewolves, and takes place in New Orleans, I am all about it. Absolutely love it. The Originals, by the way, not sponsored by The Originals or that channel, but is one of my favorite shows. I love The Originals, and I love Vampire Diaries. And some of that Originals and Vampire Diaries was actually filmed in my part of the country. So yeah, makes me more of a fan. Anyhow, let's go on. So they speak about the Carter brothers. So they are one of New Orleans vampire legends. So I'm going to look up the vampire legend of the Carter brothers. So if you hear me typing, that's why. And like I said, I'm going to give credit where credit is due because I get my research from the good old internet. And I don't want to take credit for somebody else's, article. Anyhow, this comes from New Orleans GhostTours.com, the legend of the Carter brothers. They do ghost tours in New Orleans. So, I didn't personally go on one. I was busy working at Project Lazarus. We volunteered there and cleaned up the fountains and cleaned up the grounds about Project Lazarus. But, yeah, I kind of witnessed a ghost tour while I was there because, there are numerous ghost tours there. So it's interesting. I would like to take a ghost tour one of these days in New Orleans. My husband has never been to New Orleans, and that's just really sad. We need to fix that. I'm going to take a sip of water because my throat is really dry and I've been yawning. And yeah, I've been tired. This weather has made me really tired. Anyhow, sippy, a little bit of ASMR there for you. Anyhow, I digress. So, as you know, New Orleans is famous for its legendary stories of vampires. And this article was posted on 9/5 of 2025, and it was updated October 11th of 2025. It doesn't give an author, but yeah. So, however, many forget the tale of the Carter brothers. So I'm going to be talking about that today. Two self-proclaimed vampires who carried out a string of grisly murders in the Big Easy. Decades before Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire, which I absolutely love the movie, and now they have the television series, which is incredible. Incredible. If you have not watched it and you love Anne Rice, watch it. But viewer discretion is very strongly advised. Anyhow. So the Carter brothers were among several alleged vampires residing in New Orleans, although much of their story remains a mystery to this very day. The Carter brothers' vampiric escapades are still a chilling piece of New Orleans history and lore. Getting ready for your big trip to New Orleans. If you're not, you need to go to New Orleans if you've never been there. So, no vacation in the Big Easy is complete without learning about the city's folklore of ghosts, hauntings, vampires, and voodoo. So, if you want to, you can actually book a tour on this website. And like I said, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. I will link this website down below. But the question you might be asking yourself right at this very moment, who are the Carter brothers? So in the midst of the Great Depression, a young girl was seen frantically running down Royale Street in New Orleans. It seemed as if she was running for her life. As the city would soon find out, she actually was. After being stopped by police, the girl made an unbelievable statement. She had been held captive by vampires. Despite their skepticism, police did investigate the apartment of John and Wayne Carter, and what the authorities discovered chilled them to their very core and bones. They found multiple bodies drained of none other than blood, as if vampires had been feeding off of them. The story would only get more surreal from that moment. The legend of the Carter brothers. It was a perfectly normal day in New Orleans when the story of the Carter brothers was revealed. The year was 1932, and the United States was 3 years into the Great Depression. By all accounts, the once booming seaport city of New Orleans had fallen on hard times. Many people were unemployed, and the streets were unusually deserted. That is, until a panicked girl was seen running down Royale Street. A police officer eventually stopped the girl to find out what was wrong. According to the girl, she had been abducted by two men who were vampires. She claimed that she was one of several victims being held at their apartment and used for food supply. The girl explained that she only escaped because her restraints had not been tied tight enough. The skeptical police officer decided to check out the girl's allegations, because she did have wounds and looked gray as if she had lost a lot of blood. So the police did investigate. Two officers arrived at the apartment located in the 800 block of Royale Street, at the corner of Royale and St. Anne. Upon entering the apartment, they were horrified by the sights as well as the smells that awaited them. The officers found 4 men and women, half alive, bound to chairs in one room. Their wrists were covered in blood-stained bandages. In another room, the smell of decomposition filled the air. At least 2 corpses were wrapped in sheets, although some sources maintain that there were many more victims in the apartment. Creepy. The girl and the living victims stated that the men holding them captive would leave at daybreak and arrive back at nightfall. That seems like vampiric activity. It was then that they would remove the victims' bandages, cut open their wrists, and their blood, and put their blood into cups, drain their blood into cups, that the 2 men would drink from. Realizing that they had to capture the men when they arrived home that evening, the police recruited 8 of their most imposing officers to be ready to capture the men. The case only got stranger from that point, I can imagine. Upon returning home, the 2 men were ambushed by the officers. Each man was about 5'6" and weighed about 160 pounds, but incredibly strong. However, the men were eventually subdued and taken into custody. The men turned out to be brothers John and Wayne Carter. They were dock workers, which accounted for why they left at daybreak and only returned home once the sun set. The brothers immediately confessed to their crimes. They also begged officers to murder them. They told the police that if they weren't killed, they would continue draining innocent people of their blood, because they were, in fact, vampires. The fate of the Carter brothers and their victims. As the story goes, the Carter brothers were arrested and put on trial for their crimes. Unable to prove that they were either insane or actual vampires, the brothers were found guilty and sentenced to death. Depending on the source, the brothers were either executed together or at least a year apart. Whatever the story may be, the whereabouts of their bodies are still a mystery. In the first version, the brothers were executed at the same time and placed in the same crypt. A year later, their bodies were exhumed. However, the corpse of John and Wayne Carter had vanished, sparking fear that they were indeed vampires. In the second version, one brother died after the other. When the second brother was placed in the crypt, it was discovered that the first had disappeared. Again, locals were terrified that a vampire was on the loose. Can't say as I blame them. As for the victims, it's rumored that one of the men went on to become a serial killer who murdered over 400 people. One of the female victims was so traumatized by the ordeal that she committed herself to a mental hospital. Do you blame her? So, were the Carter brothers real? Did they actually exist? You may be asking yourself this very question. Although the Carter brothers are an integral part of vampire lore in New Orleans, some question whether or not they actually existed. There are no court records of John and Wayne Carter being arrested or put on trial in New Orleans. There are also no records to substantiate that they were executed by the state. And in fact, no one is quite sure whether the story of the Carter brothers where the story came from. For skeptics, the Carter brothers are simply an urban legend. There's a lot of urban legends. So, haunted New Orleans. So, it's unlikely that the story of the Carter brothers will ever fully be solved or debunked. Was this merely an urban legend that cropped up during a dark time in American history? Or did vampires truly walk the streets of New Orleans? Whatever the truth may be, New Orleans is the place in the United States to learn about haunting tales of vampires. So I'm going to include some links down below, obviously. So that was a short story. There's another okay. So I'm going to tell you another story about a supposed vampire in New Orleans because Jacques in the Comte de Saint Germain. I probably mispronounced that and I apologize, but I heard about this the other day. Like somebody was talking about it, and I wish I could remember who was talking about it because I would love to give credit where credit is due. But anyhow, I'm going to talk about Jacques de Saint Germain, I believe, is the name. And here we go. Let's see if I can find that article. Oh my gosh, I just popped it up. Oh, all these pop-ups, they drive me nuts. I can't stand these pop-ups. Love the internet. Anyhow, so this comes from ancientorigins.net, unexplained phenomena, vampire New Orleans, mysterious case Jacques in Comte de Saint Germain. Anyhow, Let me see who this article is written by. Marita Crandall. I really need to wear my glasses. And it was published January 28th of 2024. Of course, I'm going to be including a link, so there you go. So if vampires actually existed in our modern age, it would be easy to imagine them in New Orleans. That's why I love New Orleans. It's shrouded in mystery and supernatural phenomena, and it's just, I love it there so much. I love New Orleans so much. I want to go back. It's been a very long time since I've been in New Orleans. So, here we go. The reason why this show is called Belongs to the Shadows, I'm going to go off on a tangent here because this is the perfect time to explain why this show is called Belongs to the Shadows. As you can imagine, I'm sure you all have used your imagination and have come up with a reason why I titled this podcast Belongs to the Shadows. Because in New Orleans, you think about like creepy things coming out of the shadows. There's like a lot of dark alleyways and dark buildings, and of course the cemeteries there are very dark and creepy, and you definitely don't want to explore a cemetery by yourself. If you go to New Orleans, please be safe and actually go on a tour with a tour group to the cemetery. You do not want to go by yourself there. Anyhow, I'm going to tell you about another vampire in New Orleans. I came across this story. I wish I could remember whose Instagram I came across so that I could give them credit. But there is another vampire story that takes place in New Orleans. And the author of this article, let me get to the top here, is Marita Crandall, and it was published on January 28th of 2024. And it is on ancientorigins.net, Unexplained Phenomena, Vampire New Orleans, Mysterious Case of Jacques and Comte de Saint-Germain. So, yeah, a vampire in New Orleans. The Mysterious Case of Jacques and the Comte de Saint-Germain. Hopefully I pronounced that right. So, if vampires existed in our modern times, modern age, you could easily place them in New Orleans. New Orleans is a perfect backdrop for vampires, as well as witches and werewolves and all that good stuff. You can have them creeping from the shadows of the crypts in the St. Louis Cemetery, or prowling for victims in the unlit alleys of the French Quarter. The Crescent City, and as well as the beauty and darkness, go hand in hand, and history steps forward to make itself known in the present day. Ancient legends of these immortal creatures made their way to America along with the immigrants and adapted to their New Orleans and the new land. Most enduring vampiric legends has its roots in old European folklore. So, according to the stories, sometimes in the early 1900s, a mysterious man arrived in New Orleans under the name Jacques Saint-Germain. He was handsome, elegant, wealthy, entertaining, extravagant, mysterious, and maybe a bit curious. His reputation preceded him, and he was soon a major hit in New Orleans society. The eccentric Jacques Saint-Germain. The eccentric Jacques Saint-Germain is said to have taken residence, guess the street, none other than located at 1039 Royale Street. Saint Germain was apparently a cavalier and quite the ladies' man, frequently seen with beautiful women on his arms while strolling through the French Quarter or partying in elegant locales late into the night. He delighted in throwing elaborate dinner parties for the city's socialites. His parties were highly anticipated due to their lavish cuisine, fine wine, and entertainment. Most relished, however, was his own conversation. Saint Germain fascinated his guests with stories from France, Italy, Africa, and Egypt. Visitors were delighted and amused by his eloquent grasp of the English language. They were a bit confused, however, because when Saint Germain spoke of events hundreds of years in the past in such precise detail, as though he himself had participated in these events, many guests placed little value in the truth of his tales, simply embracing them for the entertainment value during their visits to his home. Not long after his arrival to New Orleans, Saint Germain claimed he was a direct descendant of Comte de Saint Germain. Whew, that's a mouthful. A close friend and servant to the King Louis. In the 18th century, his claim aroused skepticism, but his resemblance to Comte was uncanny. Eagle-eyed guests noted that portraits never depicted the Comte older than around 40 years, which happened to be the same age that Jacques Saint Germain had appeared since he arrived in New Orleans. Rumors started to spread and just that Jacques Saint Germain may in fact be the very celebrated Comte Saint Germain himself, somehow rendered immortal and ageless. Jacques seemed to enjoy the mystery he had created around his persona and neither confirmed nor denied it. Although Saint Germain's catered parties were highly celebrated, the host was said to have relished in his guests' satisfaction of offered feasts, without partaking himself, often standing apart from the table, drinking from a lavish chalice, presumably filled with wine or blood. During dinner, he offered fantastical recollections of his adventures for his guests' enjoyment. The very strange habit of not partaking in his meals at his own soirees, coupled with his remarkable resemblance to the Comte Saint Germain, had some in the city suggesting in good fun that perhaps the mysterious man was in fact a vampire. A sinister turn of events. So these rumors took a sinister turn several months after Saint Germain rewind Saint Germain's arrival to New Orleans. When the police were called to Saint Germain's home to investigate the circumstances leading to a woman who had seemingly fallen from his gallery, a full story above. His guest, a woman who was rumored to have been a prostitute, had in fact leapt from his balcony rather than fallen, as bystanders had originally surmised. While she survived the fall, she was terrified. I would be too. People on the street surrounded her and tended to her needs while help was rounded. Hysterical, the woman ranted that she had jumped to escape Saint Germain, who had bitten her neck. She screamed and sobbed out her story, claiming she was only able to escape when her assailant was briefly distracted by a rather loud knocking on his door. So the woman was taken to the hospital as soon as possible, and the police, suspecting that she had become delusional, told the very well-known, affluent, and respected Saint Germain not to bother coming in for questioning at this late hour, but rather to please visit the police station in the morning to go over the accounts of that evening. Money talks, people. Money talks. The police were confident that there was a reasonable explanation for what had transpired. The next morning, Saint Germain never appeared at the police station. In fact, to everyone's chagrin, he had completely vanished overnight, leaving the majority of his belongings behind. Guilty. Legend suggests that upon breaking into his house, the police were cautious and in great anticipation of what they might have encountered or might see. On the second floor of the house, they discovered a series of opened but corked wine bottles. Upon closer investigation, however, they discovered the large collection of bottles were filled with a terrifying mixture of wine and none other than large quantities of human blood. Jacques Saint Germain was never seen again. He had disappeared just as mysteriously as he had arrived. As one can only imagine, his contemporaries were shocked at this scandal, feeling so betrayed and fooled, and probably a little disappointed that the fun had come to an end. So, questions remain unanswered, and this is where the legend of Jacques Saint Germain as a vampire began to flourish. Had the Comte Saint Germain of the 1700s made his way to America? So, the resemblance is uncanny, and his mysterious disappearance and all that leads us to think that he, in fact, was a vampire. So they include in this article a letter from Horace Walpole. I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to bore you with that. And then they give you more strange stories of the Comte de Saint Germain and all that. I'm going to include this link below so you all can read it for yourselves. But I think that is a very interesting story. Like I said, I came across it on Instagram, and I really wish I could remember who was telling the story on Instagram. But I wanted to investigate it more, and I wanted to investigate other vampire stories that take place in New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans is filled to the brim with supernatural history, vampire stories, witch stories, voodoo stories. I believe a lot of it's real, but, you should visit New Orleans for yourself if you ever get a chance, and go on one of the ghost tours. Read about the history and research the history of New Orleans. I love New Orleans. It's interesting. It's really, really interesting. And like I said, I spent some time in New Orleans. I went to a Catholic university, and we took a mission trip there, and we helped out with Project Lazarus. And I've talked about this before on my podcast and my channel, but we helped out at Project Lazarus, and we did volunteer work there. And it was very rewarding. We would volunteer at Project Lazarus, cleaning the grounds and the water fountains and everything, and spending time with some of the residents there. A lot of interesting people. I got to talk to a lot of interesting people, and I really enjoyed my time there. But we would volunteer during the day, and then in the evening, probably around 2 or 3 o'clock, the rest of the evening was ours to do with whatever we wanted. So we could, go to restaurants, we could explore shops, we could go to Ripley's, believe it or not, whatever we felt like doing. And what I thought was interesting at Project Lazarus is said that the courtyard was donated by Anne Rice as well as Rosie O'Donnell. So that's really, really cool. It's really cool. And the father that we were with on this trip pointed out the House of the Rising Sun. And then there was also, I got to see one of the filming locations for the movie Interview with a Vampire. So that's really cool. Like, I got to see the outside of the building. I didn't get to go in because the museum was actually closed whenever we got off from volunteering for the day. But it was so neat to get to walk the streets of New Orleans, and it was very, very interesting to, like, you know, think that a lot of Anne Rice's stories took place on the very streets that I was walking. I love New Orleans. My husband's never been, and I'm hoping to go back to New Orleans, me and him. I keep teasing him. I'm like, you have a built-in tour guide. Like, I remember a lot about New Orleans, but of course I went to New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina, and I'm sure Hurricane Katrina changed a lot of the stores and things in New Orleans. So it's not going to be the same New Orleans that I remember, but I hope that some of what I remember remains. I like New Orleans for the fact that you don't feel judged there. Like, you feel like you can be yourself in New Orleans, and just the sense of the spices drifting out to the street from the shops, and just like the history there. It's a wonderful place to visit. So if you ever get a chance to visit, please do. Please do. Anyhow, I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Belongs to the Shadows. And, if you have an idea for a podcast episode, please drop it below. I always try to read the comments, and I take, ideas into consideration. Some of my podcast episode ideas did come from listeners, did come from fans. So I really appreciate it. Anyhow, until next time, stay creepy.